Welcome, everyone, to this Good Leadership Podcast. My name is Charles Good, your host and the president of the Institute for Management Studies. This podcast is designed to provide you with actionable insights and tools that you can use from discussing the research, stories, and background from recognized experts and practitioners to accelerate your impact in your current role. Today, I'm very glad to be joined on the podcast by Dr. Jennifer Kahnweiler. She's a certified speaking professional, best-selling author, and one of the top global leadership speakers on introverts in the workplace. Her pioneering books, The Introverted Leader, Quiet Influence, The Genius of Opposites, and Creating an Introvert-friendly Workplace, which is going to be the focus of our program today, have been translated into 18 different languages. She also helps organizations harness the power of introverts. She has partnered with leading organizations such as Amazon, Merck, NASA, Bosch, the U.S. Centers for Disease Control, and many others. She delivers her signature presentations from Singapore to Spain, and she has a mission in helping organizations eliminate their anti-introvert bias. Welcome to the program, Jennifer.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here, Charles. Thanks for having me.
So I always like to start each episode with kind of telling us why you got interested in this field, because you are an extrovert, correct?
Right. I am an extrovert and a champion of introverts. And so there's kind of two-pronged reason. The first was, I guess, the reason a lot of us do the work we do is sometimes influenced, right, by family members. So I've been a long-time partner and spouse of a confirmed and proud introvert. And in those early days, before I even was exposed to the Myers-Briggs and knew about introversion, I really just scratched my head a lot to try to figure out this guy. We'd go out together and he'd be fine, sociable with people, but then we'd go back and he would have to decompress. And I didn't realize that it wasn't about me. But, I wanted to talk about the event like extroverts do, and he wanted to just recover. And so I learned through the years about introversion, and it really did help our relationship most of the time. Back then, he listened to me a lot more, Charles. But then I also was moving into working in organizations, in various roles as a coach and as a leadership development OD person. And I would always be very interested in that, in seeing and concerned, honestly, to see many introverts were being passed over for opportunities or were very frustrated themselves that they weren't heard, talked over in meetings, et cetera. And so I kind of took that up as a silent cause. And then when I decided to expand my speaking career and write my first solo book, I was drawn to helping the introverts in my world, and I wrote a book called The Introverted Leader back in 2010. And people weren't even talking about it much then, but it certainly has, seen the light of day, thankfully, since that time.
That's great to hear. Thank you for providing that background. I mean, I believe that we still even live in a world that celebrates extroversion and speaking up. And the results, right, are that organizations often dismiss potential employees with more introverted qualities for not being the people they would like to say, have a beer with, like you mentioned in your book.
Yeah.
Or if they do get hired, they're passed over for promotion to not exhibiting those typical extroverted leadership qualities. And it kind of makes this lose-lose proposition. Do you feel this is still the same way, or are we moving in the right direction?
I think yes and no. It's changing. As I mentioned, it's more people are aware of introversion and what it is and what it isn't. There were so many myths before. As we have more, one of the indicators is that, for instance, I would use as a barometer of change in some of our larger companies. We're familiar with ERGs, right? Employee resource groups. Right when I was finishing this book, Creating Introvert-friendly Workplaces, I was received an email from a leader at an organization in Ohio, which had created an actual ERGs for introverts. And they turned out to not be the first ones who did that. They banded together, and not so much out of frustration, but really in a desire to have camaraderie and collegiality and support, but also to educate the rest of their tech company about what an introvert is. So we got the conversation going, and even created like very practical sort of things that you say or don't say to an introvert. They were educating people, having forums, bringing in senior leaders. And this type of model has now, over I would say the last 3 or 4 years, with the expansion of diversity, equity, inclusion, we're seeing introversion be a part of that conversation. And so for that, I'm very grateful. That's on the positive side. Yet we still have so much bias, even among my people in my profession, my speaker friends. I was telling them about the podcast that I'm starting about introverts And extroverts, they said, well, you can't use introvert in the title. Somebody said to me, they said, that's a very negative word. Now that's among people who supposedly know human development, right? And are
Right.
aware of trends. So, I mean, even in that world, it's still frustrating. So I think on a lot of levels that if you ask introverts, they'll tell you there's still quite a bit of bias.
I would agree with you. So why don't we start with what is an introvert and how much of the workforce do you think is comprised of introverts?
Well, the term really goes back to the time of Carl Jung, who was a psychologist around the time of Freud. And he came up with this personality type that he called an introvert. And by the way, he said it's more nuanced than that, right? So that, you will show extroverted qualities if you are an introvert. But in any case, he really came up with that term. And it really, for him, and I think it's really kind of stayed with that in addition to other definitions, is been around energy and where you get your energy. And like I mentioned, my husband, Bill, who would go back into our tiny apartment and go to one side, I go to the other, and he would decompress. Well, introverts need that time to recharge. Now, on the other hand, I'll just throw in extroverts on the other side of the spectrum, if you will, or maybe closer to the other side of me, but they are energized by stimulation. So it's outside stimulation, people, events, going and doing, and they deflate when they don't have enough of that engagement. And people do, when you talked about bias, Charles, I think a lot of people will misconstrue the idea of an introvert being kind of a loner and not liking people. And that's not true at all. Introverts love people, but it's just in how much they're going to take in doses. So that's kind of the general overarching view. Now, yeah. And so one thing that has happened is there's been more brain research. And so we're realizing that extroverts need more of this chemical called dopamine that's in the brain, where introverts do get shut down if they have too much of it. So I think that's very exciting, those kind of, studies that are happening. And we're talking more about the word stimulation when we describe things. It's like, how much stimulation can you take? And I think that's a good way to look at it. One thing I will share with you about a question that I will ask people is, when you've been with people all day, do you need a break? And introverts won't even hesitate. They'll go, absolutely yes, And extroverts will go, yes. And I don't need it. It's like not a must have. So it's sometimes a good way to kind of decide, if you're more introvert or extroverted.
Well, in the book, you use that as a litmus test question, right? Of
Yeah,
do
yeah.
you need to have quiet recharging time after being around people? And if you say yes, then you're more in that introvert spectrum. But I love how you describe it in the book too, right? Because don't think of introversion as a black or white.
Right.
There's a spectrum of it. You can fall somewhere on the bell curve. There's introverts that have extroverted traits and extroverts that have introverted traits. And you can also be an ambivert. So it's not something where you either are one or the other. You're probably some mix of both, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And you asked also how much of the world is made up of introverts. The estimation from consulting psychologists, press, and others is that it's about 40 to 60% of the workforce falls,
Uh,
even as you said, even slightly on the introvert side, which is really quite staggering if you think about it in our organizations that many of our, listeners are connected with. If we're not tapping into that talent, if we're kind of overriding those folks, think of what we're missing in terms of their engagement in the organization, but also the ideas and the innovation and all of that, organizations need to thrive on. Even a business case can be made, like in other aspects of diversity, if we're missing that huge chunk of people. But I did want to add something to what you said too, because I'm an extrovert. So I thinking out loud as I talk, right? So I have to kind of show that. But I think that a lot of times, we think, we need to know also what our qualities are, what our strengths are. And so that's a clarity that I think helps all of us. So if we know there's an introvert that, I need to be prepared and calmness is important to me, those kinds of things. If I can plug into that, and there we identify like 6 other key strengths in the book, Quiet Influence. If I can really build on those instead of trying to become an extrovert, for instance, then I can be so much more successful. So like the preparation, for instance, if I know that's really key in my presentations, then I'm going to be prepared when I get into the room. I'll be able to just relax and be in the moment. There's a 4 Ps model that I have in that book, The Introverted Leader, which a lot of introverts finds helpful because it takes them through a sequence, again, building on their quiet strengths.
Be great if you could just kind of just talk briefly about that and just kind of go through those 4
Sure.
Ps, because I definitely agree with
Like
you.
models. We like models, right, Charles?
You got it.
Steps. Exactly. This came from the mouths, if you will, or the pens of introverted leaders who shared with me what I asked them the question, what do you do to be successful? Again, with that idea of not trying to do it the extrovert way. And so the first thing they do is prepare, and they make sure that even if they don't have, let's say, an agenda for a meeting, they ask for one. you know, if they go to a networking event, they understand what their purpose is. So there's all kinds of examples that we have in the book, The Introverted Leader, which shows how they apply that strength to different scenarios, interviewing, all kinds of things. So the next thing is presence. So once you prepare and you've like thought about, what you're envisioning and you feel like you have the tools to be successful in that situation, then you get there and you're present. And I think a lot of us make the real mistake now, and I would say introverts and extroverts, with all of the distractions we have, that we really aren't present in those conversations and, in those meetings or with that project. And I think that you will find that what people tell me is that the best introverted leaders they've had, or the leaders in general, but particularly introverts, are with them when they're with them. Their feet are there, they're tuned in, they're listening, because that's another skill that's constantly brought out when I ask about people, what is the strength of introverts? They'll talk about that listening, engaged listening, focused conversations. And that presence is vital. Then the third P is push. And that has to do with stepping outside your comfort zone. So they're always kind of putting themselves in situations where they can stretch themselves and take on, let's say, if it's a presentation they've only made to a small group, they're going to expand that and figure out how they're going to get a larger group to talk to. So it's like incremental steps to get better, which shows a lot of discipline and intentionality. And that's why a lot of times people will say, you're not an introvert. They'll constantly say that to them. And they'll say, no, I really am. You don't know how introverted I really am. But I've been working on this, so I've got the skill down. I'm never going to be totally comfortable with it. So I think that's really key. And then the fourth one is practice. So they look for opportunities to refine those skills. And, I always use the example of Jerry Seinfeld, the comedian, who, talks about, like, if he does not perform, and all of us as an aside would say, like, does he really need to be performing? And he's probably a billionaire by now, and he's at the top of his game. But he said, if I don't keep doing that, it's like broadband that shrivels up, and that I'm not going to be good at my game, and I have to keep practicing and refining it. And I find that too with my speaking and with my skills. If you don't do it, then you do get rusty and you don't get good anymore. Your competency goes down. And so they're always looking for opportunities to practice. And I've just been very impressed by the model being put into use by the introverted leaders who I work with.
I love that model. And for me, from talking to so many leaders, especially those that are introverts, and there's a surprising number that are introverts that people may not know, but that pressing piece, right? That really is the key skill to get them out of their comfort zone and to get practice in those areas over time.
Pushing, right? The push. And it's pushing enough, Charles, so it's not like when you go to the gym, and you come back the next day, you can't get out of bed. I've had that time, but you're pushing just enough that you're going to feel it, but they say, go to the edge, you go to the edge and then you're like, okay, that's fine for now. This applies to so many areas of leadership. I mean, if you think about it, communication, it applies, I mentioned, to networking, to presentations, to managing up with, your leaders. So when you have to really pitch or advocate for your people. So it kind of crosses the spectrum.
That's great. Wanted to move into some of those myths around introversion so we can dispel those, because usually many people think it's synonymous with shyness.
Right.
And you disagree with that. And then you list some other myths of what people typically think that introverts are.
You ask introverts, they'll tell you, they will tell you many things where people have misconstrued that they're antisocial, they're slow, they don't make decisions, in a timely manner. And with that, people say, well, they don't have ideas, they don't bring anything to the table. And that's just because, again, they're in their heads. I've heard this a lot from women. I think they get a harder rap sometimes around the judgments that are made about they're angry, that idea that they're, just because they're not showing a lot of smiles, like, women are supposed to be the stereotypical, like, friendly and outgoing. And if they're, I've heard this a lot for women in male dominated professions or in companies. In science, engineering, they'll say, if I'm not like, Miss Happy-Go-Lucky, then they think I'm really mad at them and I'm plotting some kind of nefarious scheme or that kind of thing. There's mostly negatives, that are put around around introverts and that, they don't have a lot of connections when in fact, the connections they have are like deeper oftentimes because they spend the time to have these to get to know the person. And a lot of times extroverts will judge that by saying, oh, they're being like secretive. But, a lot of times introverts really want to get to know you. So they don't like share a lot of personal information in the beginning. But once you get to know them, they go deep. So, those are some of the things that I think can get in their way, those negative impressions.
Well, and some of the things around shyness too, right? Because introverts have low key facial expressions. They're private at first. They
Mhm.
don't prefer talking right away. So all of that can be construed, right? Where they're just shy when in reality, that's not necessarily the case.
There's quite a bit of literature on this that shyness really has to do with anxiety, social and psychological anxiety, whereas introversion is really how you're wired. There shouldn't be any judgment around that. It's just the way you come into the world. And the problem becomes we have organizations and a world that is really type A extroverted. So introverts are constantly having to adapt to that world. My whole mission, really, with this latest work, and I guess with all of my work, really, is to get all of us to listen and to say, no, the world doesn't have to be extroverted all the time, right? We can have organizations where you allow for quiet. We don't have to meet on every project. I was just reading about the invention of COBOL with Grace Hopper or even Einstein. They worked on those projects alone. So look, we are really skewed towards collaboration, towards meeting in teams. That's what I mean by an example of the extroverted workplace or the society that we have. And I think we need to take a look at that and say, no, let's shift this, considering we have so many people that don't really operate that way.
Well, and in the book too, you list some considerations for introverted friendly workplace design. And they really follow three key activities, right? Around collaboration, socialization, and focused work. So if you could
Right.
go into each one and just kind of help our listeners identify how they can create these more introverted friendly workplaces with those three key activities, especially.
That is something that I gained from talking with the office design firm Gensler. They're quite in the news now because they're doing a lot of research and reporting on how do we transition these offices right into looking differently than they do. So the collaboration piece, yeah, as I was kind of segueing off what I was talking about, there are times we have to meet with other people, but let's look at those collaborative times in the office. Maybe we have one-on-one meetings. And certainly so much of us is now is remote and hybrid that we don't necessarily need to have everybody in the room. Like who should we be connecting with on that collaboration? Brainstorming is a part of that, right? So maybe there's some brainwriting that goes on where you use your collaborative tools on Slack and other methodologies to do that or in person at the old whiteboard, right? There's some of that needs to go on projects. The socialization was the other one. And there's been some interesting research or differences, I would say, in the trends that are being reported on. And that we were thinking, and I did a survey during the pandemic where people are saying, yeah, I'm towards the end, kind of like, I really would like to connect with people more, not with the happy hours on Zoom, but I do really miss people. And I am hearing that, when I've seen some of these situations where I've gone back into offices where we've had an event, people seem to not even want to leave. I mean, they're just so hungry to be together again, I think, because of the last few years. I think companies are really thinking through how do we build in some of that socialization? Maybe it's an offsite retreat or however they're doing that, maybe certain days within the office where we coordinate that so that people are there together and they're not just like, coming in and out. So this takes a lot of really thinking through also not just what works, logistically for our company, but also considering personality type in there. And then finally, focus. Now, interesting focus, you would think, well, okay, working at home is focus, right? You could work into the night and not have any barriers. That's a problem with that. But people are very happy. In fact, even before all this happened in the last few years with the lockdowns, when I did research for this book, which was before the pandemic, people said introverts, it was all for introverts. We had 240 responded that survey. They talked about the fact that they got more work done remotely. Now, interesting, I just read recently, there was another report, and I believe this was Gensler, that talked about focus now being one of the top reasons people go back in the office because there are too many distractions at home and they need another space. And so we also talk about co-working as an option for that too, because then you have that kind of what I talk about in the book and is communal solitude, where you have people around, you have that energy, but it's not in the same room you're in or the same little corner of your dining room or bedroom. So those three areas, right? Collaboration, focus, and socialization are all things to consider when you are planning your strategy in the office.
Well, and you list some great ones that I've heard you before too. And one that really surprised me, that obviously you want to have people that need to collaborate together should be hopefully located together or in close proximity. But,
Mhm.
spaces for natural mingling are important to
Yeah.
lower the barrier for introverts to interact with coworkers, which I, kind
Yeah.
of thought was counterintuitive because maybe they didn't want that proximity to force them to mingle. But I mean, it
Mhm.
does reduce the barriers to help them to have that connection with their coworkers, whether it's remote or in
Yeah.
the office.
And I really found when I went out and looked at some of the companies in the valley, I guess they call it Silicon Valley, they were very creative about that. One I remember at Bosch had it was their research and development area had like a area where it was called the chocolate corner, and people come in and they had chocolate there, and you were not allowed to talk about work there. So they structured it for the mostly introverted engineers to have a way to kind of have some laughs and just kind of get to know each other. And this kind of builds off of what Steve Jobs did at Pixar, I believe it was. I think I mentioned it in the book, was around, really designing things so that to walk to the restroom, you had to go through other areas. And it was even other companies did that with the kitchen. So if you want to get a cup of coffee, you were bound to run into other people. And so I think that is key. And I think one of the things you get from that, however it's going to work virtually, and I'm sure we can figure out a way to do that in some way, is that you also get those spontaneous ideas. You also have the context for the work that you're doing. So you're not just, working with your team on your projects, but, you want to have an idea of what else is going on in the company. Where does your work fit into that? Who might be a resource for you? Right. So it's
Absolutely.
right. It's I think it is more challenging virtually. You agree?
I definitely agree. I mean, I think, with Zoom fatigue hitting in and people just, not really understanding the best practices, or maybe they have a good sense of what would work in an office environment,
Yeah.
but then they are really don't know what works in a virtual environment. So having Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, I've heard you mention in the past on some of
Mhm.
the Zoom meetings, it's better to have some quiet time for reflection, or in breakouts, do it with smaller groups instead of larger
Yes.
groups to help the introverts out. I'd love for you to share some of those best practices because everyone's trying to figure out how to keep people engaged during these virtual meetings and really focusing on the introverts, right? How to keep them
Right.
better engaged
Right.
during some of these
Well,
meetings.
so one thing is to decide if you need a meeting. I think we go into automatic pilot thinking, oh, we have to meet on this. No, you may not need to meet. Maybe you just need to reach out to that person, have a quick call, or just have a quick email dialogue with them. Some of the best practices I mentioned, but I'm also seeing is that companies are saying, okay, we're not meeting on this day, a certain day like Fridays or whatever. And this all helps the introverts, by the way. It helps everybody, but I think the introverts are so grateful for it. They're also saying we have to end the meeting 10 minutes before the hour. We're not having you go from meeting to meeting. You need to have a break. You need to stretch. You need to go take care of your life's needs. Those are some other things. You mentioned the breakouts. That's really an underutilized tool, I believe, on our Zoom and our other technologies. Just run a test of it. Like ask your group a question. And let's say you have a group of 20. You're going to get probably the extroverts talking. Maybe you'll get some introverts writing in the chat. But you take that same question, divide it up into 4 breakouts. You give them a certain amount of time. Doesn't have to be a lot of time. You give them the question. You have them talking. You're going to just visit those rooms. It reminds me of when I used to walk around the live training room, and it would be so quiet in the large group. And then you would hear this engagement, right? And these ideas would be coming forth that you never would have heard in the larger group. I'm really biased towards doing more breakouts. I think that's a really good technique. Also, the chat is another place that, I've been on calls where people have banned the use of inter-student chat, and I don't think that's a good idea at all. They're doing it because they don't want people to be distracted from the professor, or whoever's talking. But that's where a lot of the richness comes too. People will suggest resources and ideas and question things. And I mean, it can get out, I guess it could get out of control a little bit, but I think you've done a lot of that, Charles. So the chat's a resource for introverts.
Oh, you're right. How about having video on or off? What would you recommend?
Good question. I recommend having it on at the beginning, right? And at the end. And at select times, perhaps if people can do it throughout. But I don't have a hard and fast rule for that. I think it's very exhausting for introverts and for actually, frankly, all of us to keep it on for meeting after meeting. The extroverts, let's kind of take their seat for a minute. They really appreciate having the facial expressions. They read a lot through that. I mean, introverts do too, but I think the extroverts really thrive on that. Their brain kind of seeks out facial expressions. So keep in mind who's in your group as well. And, there's no hard and fast rule. You can even bring it up to the group, make it a decision that they weigh in on. So they're not feeling like you're forcing them to do one or the other. I always believe in sort of whenever possible with meetings to do a plus delta, a real quick one to what's working about our meeting, what's not, and then let's see what we can change. So you're not forcing cameras on or off.
Oh, that's great. I love some of the advice you give around leading introverts, because I think that's a really important area that people really need to recognize. One tip that I really love, and I'd love for you to share another one, is recognize that there are going to be introverts on your team, or there could be. Ask them about their work style and communication preferences so they feel acknowledged and supported. Don't assume that you know what they prefer. You can expand upon that one, or is there another one you wanted to share in terms of tips around leading introverts?
I think that one of the areas that we need to think about is recognizing that there is an elephant in the room and really talking about introversion, because, this has not been until recently, as we said earlier, on the minds of most leaders, right? This isn't an element that they were, necessarily keeping them up at night. But I think what we have found from leaders being more self-disclosive, either about themselves, talking about their own story to their teams and sharing sort of what they've been through and what's worked for them and what hasn't. Those best practices then get kind of built into the culture. So I think it's really important that leaders at all levels bring this up. And in the assessments that we do with teams, that's one thing where we can talk about what's our style. How do we like to get information, give information? Let's be transparent about it. I have in the book, I believe I have a sheet that Google created that they use and other companies use, which, talks a little bit about your style. So people aren't mind readers. They're not trying to guess how you like to work together. And
Right.
oh God, that would save so much time for so many of us if we do that, right? With teams. So I think talking about it, making it legitimate as a topic. And I think then it creates a sense of psychological safety for people in the environment.
Well, I think also even communicating, I found when you pause during your conversation, that allows time for
Yes.
really the introverts, but everyone just to reflect and respond thoughtfully instead of just barraging them with question after question or just not taking a breath for 20 minutes, right?
No, absolutely. And we talked in the communication chapter, I think, too, about like how there's so many ways to communicate with people. And so also leaders need to realize that maybe just the way you like to come in or just give them a call extemporaneously, an introvert's going to really probably more appreciate, right? That you give them a heads up, say what the call's about, if you're going to call them, and also know that they express themselves a lot through writing. So, maybe an email could be sufficient. Even just taking a moment to think about the way we're leading with a certain type of personality, getting to know that person, that can make all the difference in terms of how you're perceived and how effective you are as a leader. And I remember Doug Conan, who was a former CEO of Campbell Soup, and he is now runs a very successful consulting company. But he always shared some great stories with me about just how he was so self-disclosive with his people and would just say, it's not about you if I'm quiet. I want you to let me know, get to know you. So all of his new employees he would have, and he would share it too, like self-disclose about what he was like, his personality, what he liked, what he didn't like. And he built very strong relationships with people. And one of the things that they remember about him, and he'll share it, is he became very famous for this, is writing personal notes to people in his team. And he did that as a person who was a thoughtful introverted leader who spent the time to get to know people, not just on his team, but throughout his company. I was always impressed with that as an example of, how you can lead as an introvert again from your strengths.
I love that story. Why don't we move to the corporate level? What should your introvert inclusion strategy be? Because you mentioned there's several corporations that are leading by example. You mentioned NASA, Bosch, Merck, who have
Right.
implemented some very intentional strategies to harness introvert power.
hmm And so I'm pulling my book out now because I'm going to focus in on what some of those strategies are. And I think I mentioned one already, which was to talk about this. And another is to research and ask introverts what they need and what they want. And so really not just giving lip service to these groups that are forming from every company, from Amazon to Kimberly Clark. I mean, I've been talking to so many over the last 2 years who have been springing up and expanding the message of introversion as well, encouraging teams to address this and being very intentional about your practices with this whole change with hybrid. One thing we didn't talk about, Charles, is the interviewing and the recruiting. That's on the minds, I think, of so many people right now who are concerned about the future of their companies as we need to retain with the fact that we have all of these labor shortages. How do we keep people, right? And so it's really paying attention to, as you mentioned, also, you picked up not just who we want to have a beer with, but what our jobs really require. And I interviewed, and I've been aware of this for years, so many people who said that if they had not advocated for the introverts that they were taking a look at in the selection process, then those people would have easily been passed over. And they had many examples of where the individual, because somebody was advocating for them, either internally for promotion or externally, they were new hires, where they rose up in the organization and to become, very, very high level and have an expansive control as well as be admired. And so I think that's one thing that we all, not just in HR, but in all areas of the company where we can, as you're looking at people, because that's our most valuable resource, is to take a look at, maybe you're trying to put them in your image if you're an extrovert, or maybe as an introvert, you're got that other kind of bias going on, right? Where you're saying maybe they aren't the right person. So just again, being aware of that as one factor, that could be really an asset, and maybe they don't interview so well, right? And setting up the environment so they are successful. I'll give that one example I think I shared in the book about the company that realized that just by splitting up their group interview process over a period of a day and a half, they were able to really get the best out of the people they were interviewing who were doing presentations. Because the people before that, they were really deflating the introverts. And so they really weren't getting a true picture of their talent. And so that's an example of taking a look, stepping back and saying what practices are working for everybody, right? All personality types, and what are not, and being intentional, not just kind of going with the same old way you've always done it.
When you make some great points, especially with bringing on great introvert talent, because we were fighting against shallow first impressions and
Right.
really our personality biases that favor extroverts and played too large of a role in the hiring process. And you're going to miss out on some great talent because you're not focusing on the right individual. And you mentioned also something, at the corporate level, what these companies are doing, they're like job redesign. Executives publicly sharing their introverted learning or leadership journeys, like the Campbell Soup story,
Yeah.
creation of these spaces for communal solitude. So there's lots of things that are being done right now that are working and can be used as examples in helping people try to integrate that within their corporate culture or just individually, right? Just to make them
Yeah.
more inclusive and less biased toward extroverts in the workplace.
One thing we kind of assume, but kind of may have passed over too quickly, is that leaders need to know themselves. I mean, that's probably true in every interview you have and every course that IMS offers. Self-awareness, it really starts with that. If you realize, that perhaps you've been always in an extroverted world, particularly working in sales, for instance, I had one manager said, oh God, we need to turn these introverts into more aggressive, talky people, that kind of thing. You get that message, even if it's not explicit, it's implicit. So you got to look at yourself and say, I think we all do. As you say, where's the bias coming from? And I need to stop and say, okay, take a look at my past, what kind of culture did I get raised? Was I raised in? Because all of that affects it. Where do I live in geography wise, that culture? What kind of companies have I worked in? What kind of bosses have I worked for? And who am I as a person? Right. And do I really want to listen? And I think that's very hard. I think as a leader, or as an individual at any level, if you're a leader in whatever you do, because I think a lot of people are leaders, we have to examine ourselves. It starts with ourselves.
That's a great way to end this episode. That it really starts with self-awareness and being aware of your strengths and your tendencies and being open and honest and authentic with the people that you lead. Thank you so much, Jennifer, for joining me today. Remind our listeners how they can get in contact with you and where they can get your great books.
Oh, thank you so much, Charles, for having me. The best place is my website. I have everything. It's kind of the hub there, Jennifer Kahnweiler. It's KAHNWEILER if you're listening.com. And then I'm very active on LinkedIn, somewhat on Instagram too. So I look forward to hearing from folks, and thank you so much.
Thank you again for joining me today. Great conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, I encourage you to share with others and post about it on social media. You can also go to our YouTube channel, which has video recordings of all the episodes of this podcast, along with bite-sized segments called single servings that are designed to answer your most pressing leadership and management questions. Remember, until next time, it's not what you know that counts, but what you do consistently that makes a difference.